So let's dig into a couple of those because, our online relationships, real relationships, this is definitely a shift. And I think probably, I think we're past kind of the stigma of like online dating, right? Like, I think that's pretty well become a norm.
Man, I read the last stat I read on that was almost 40% of today's marriages start online.
Right.
In some form or fashion.
Right. But give us like 10 years ago and it was like you met them where, and all I think is the brother from Napoleon Dynamite. But that's a different story, different podcast.
Right. Which is a funny thing. But at the time, even when that movie came out, the reason that's in that movie is because that's what was going on.
It seems so fringe at the time, right?
Yeah. At the time we were like, wow, on his 56K modem, he has a chance to meet somebody and talk to him.
Right.
And yep, he did.
Yeah. So that is an interesting question. Are online relationships, and I think the challenge is how you phrase the question, right? Yeah. So if you say, are online relationships the same as real life relationships? And I would suggest they're not. But I think if you say, are online relationships as valuable or equal to or as beneficial as in real life relationships, then I would say there's probably an argument for that. Like, I value our friendship, and I know if I'm going through something or if I have a question, I can always connect with you. And we're just not physically next to each other to do that in real life all the time.
Which, is not really a major factor at most intimacy levels of your relationship. I mean, do you need a hug? It's like, you don't need a hug for everything, but one thing I do want to say as we get into this too, are they real relationships, is first we need to understand that what I'm not saying is that just because the culture shifts that we should always embrace it. There are lots of things that the culture embraces that we should not embrace. Right. Sure. So I think that we need to make sure we say that. However, what we're talking about is a function, like how do people interact? How do people deal with each other, and how do relationships form? I think what we do as ministers, and I think that's what we are, communication people and pastors alike, we're ministers. You can't go and preach that everybody's responsible for evangelism and then not let them do it in their professional life too, just because they're a communicator. Right. You can't say it's not ministry and then say you're a minister, but what you do is not ministry. That's garbage. So when we go into this world, we have to understand that when we have the opportunity to have relationship with people, that we're not trying to say that it replaces any kind of face-to-face. We're not trying to say that it is better than or worse than.
Right.
We have to start getting to where we say it is part of.
Right.
It is part of. And that's all I'm really advocating for, is that in the online digital space, is that pastors start to accept the fact that the culture accepts the fact that digital relationships are part of relationships.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example then, just in a practical sense. Before we hopped on, my wife sent me a text message, and it's not that I have a digital relationship with my wife and I have a real life relationship with my wife. She's my wife, and we happen to interact in real life, and we also interact digitally.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the kind of, that's what most of us do. But whenever we're asked the question, is this legitimate? Does this count? The same people who would say, yeah, that's the situation, exactly what you described is true for me, but not for church.
Right.
It's like, why not? Like what's different? It's like, I know there are some differences, but like, why discount the whole part of the digital space for the sake of saying that real life, face-to-face is, you can't apply that logic to every other place of your life anyway.
Right.
You're already living in a way that doesn't reflect that. We've already accepted some of these norms like texting and FaceTiming, and even what we're doing now, video chat over computer, over Wi-Fi. Yeah. I mean, it's a friendship. It's real. I mean, the first time I ever met Kenny Jang, I'd known him for a year. He hugged me. I mean, like that's real stuff, man. It's not, I don't hug strangers. I don't like that. Right. It's weird. If you hug strangers, stop doing it. You're freaking people out. Please stop.
Yes.
But anyway, that's kind of where we're at. I think it's that, And I give this example, let me give you an example for attendance. This is where we see this play out a lot.
Sure.
4 weekends in a month. Let's just say that you have a person who first weekend attends church. Second weekend, they stay home, but they watch online. Third weekend, they don't watch online, but they go to home group that night on Sunday night. Mm-hmm. Then the fourth weekend, they come to church again. How many times did they attend church this month?
Yeah, that's an important question.
I mean, just give the listeners a second. How many times did they attend? How you answer that question really makes a difference, because how a church leader, a pastor, or even some communications people, we may say they came 2 times. Mm-hmm. But you ask that person how many times they attended.
Right.
They're going to probably say 3 or 4 because it counts for them, but it doesn't count for us. And so when they come to church and realize that all this stuff that they've done has not been recognized, appreciated, they feel invalidated, like that doesn't really matter. So why would I do that? Why when I'm on vacation would I stop and watch church if my pastor doesn't count it? I mean, that's not a good reason to go to church, but that definitely is a deterrent.
Sure.
You know, if your pastor gets on stage and goes, hey, don't just watch online. You need to be here. You need to be here. Well, the people have kind of moved on from physical a presence being what counts as attendance. And I would say that in the culture today, what counts as attendance is attention. Sure. If they give you their attention, then they have given you their attendance. I don't know how many businesses have online webinars and seminars and conferences they go to, and they count that as I went to a conference.
Right.
You know, they meet with their grandkids on FaceTime, on Skype or Zoom or whatever, and they got to see their grandkids and met with their grandkids tonight. Right. It's just in our vernacular of how we talk about this, and it makes so much sense to the people who are doing this. But in the church world, we've kind of said, no, that doesn't count.
Right.
Why?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think what we need to shift away from is tracking attendance as being the most important metric that we have. Yeah. So,
and that's a good point.
And somebody's just turned me off right there. Somebody's just unsubscribed to our podcast, but that's all right.
Dude, I already shut this place down.
It's a different story, but it's okay. So let's not think of it in like a don't worry about church attendance mode, right? That's not what I'm saying. Right. What I'm saying is, imagine you had 1,000 people who came to your church every single Sunday, but when you go to do a community event, nobody shows up and volunteers. Like if attendance is your most important metric, then apparently you're doing all right, but nobody's interested in impacting your community. Nobody's interested in going out and introducing people to Jesus. No one's interested in going on a mission trip. No one's interested in giving. So we have to shift the perspective that attendance is the most important metric. And I think it's Clay Scroggins, and I could be wrong. It may be of somebody else, but somebody said it's unfair to say that watching online doesn't count, but giving online matters.
That was Clay.
Was it Clay?
Right. He said that at a Pushpay conference.
So it's interesting that this shift needs to happen.
Yeah. And again, you know, it's not a either or situation. Right. It is a pastors, please incorporate what's happening online into your thought process and strategy of ministry at your church.
Right.
Because the less you do that, the more you seem out of touch with what's happening in the culture. And when you stand on that stage and you go, here's how to navigate life, the impression they might get is, well, you don't really take part in where we take part of life. You know, a lot of our life is lived out online. And we can either sit back and go, and let's debate whether or not that should be, you know, they shouldn't do that, or that's dangerous. And sure, there's some dangers. Warn people of that stuff. Fine. But while we debate those things, the culture's moving on.
Right.
And really what we need to decide is, how are we going to redeem that space? How are we going to redeem? That's our business, right? We redeem things. what
Right.
Jesus redeems. But we are in the business of reconciliation. That's our ministry from 1 Corinthians, right? It's that our ministry of reconciliation, bringing people back into the fold, back into a relationship with Christ. And where do people hang out 24/7? It's online. We're called to go to them.
Right.
And I'm confused why that's not a mission field, because that's where they are. And if our call is to go, not to call them to us, but to go to them, then why don't we consider that a place to go?